life living and making a living can sometimes wear us out, grind us down, and dull our senses. So for a keen mind and a sharp contributive edge that can make it all easier and better and more productive, let's take some time to sharpen our axe. Stay with us right now for Life Talk.
Hello, I'm Gina Fitt, and you've either surfed to or purposely selected Life Talk with Bern Moses. Welcome to another in our series of ongoing verbal essays brought to you in this television format. It's a pleasure to have you with us today. Bern, last week we started what I hope will be the first in a long series of discussions on a topic you call life formula. Now, this was so fascinating to me. We talked about emotions versus feelings. We talked about what it means to be existing now today, and what are the three most important gifts we have in our lives. And I thought it would be a really good idea to just discuss briefly some of the main points we went over last week as a basis for our future discussion today.
Yeah, we're accumulating a background information here that will take us through today, certainly. And you're right, we did talk about feelings and emotions, the fact that there are only two emotions and all feelings emanated from them. We made reference to the fact that we always have a choice as to what emotional state we're in. Now, typically that's a surprise to most people because oftentimes we feel out of control, subjective if you would, things are happening to us, but it need not really be that way if you can find a way to become conscious. I know we took a moment and examined about all the things that were happening in the moment. You know, the fact that we're functioning and we're in an emotional state and subject to change and posturing and libido, or rather primal states. And so we cleaned that moment up by actually going in, if I can find it here, and creating a formula. And we cleaned the moment and put all those words into a formula, which I'll tell you, a little time memorizing it, and you'll find this in your mind's eye and can refer to it literally hundreds of times a day. After a while, it becomes almost a part of us, and so life gets a whole lot easier. We talked about emotions, love and fear, primary functions, contribution and survival, postures, we respond or react, and we're doing these things every single moment of our life. We may not be able to tell if we're in a love or fear mode, but we know if we're responding or reacting, and if we're reacting, we know we're in the fear mode. That's why I call this a harmony of dichotomies. We had the formula. We talked about libido and mortido, and the impact that can have on our health. The fact that libido can produce enzymes and endorphins that spew all over our body and make us feel just great, ecstatic if you would. And they're curative in nature. And mortido, of course, is toxic, and it can actually destroy us, cause us to be ill, and even cause us to die. But all of this is about the brain. And we talked about 115 billion brain cells. That's pretty exciting. 115 billion brain cells and all the synapses that can be created from them. This is when two cells create, or rather connect, and form a synapse, a point of understanding, awareness, knowledge, or skill. And that all of these were equivalent to all the droplets of sand, droplets of water rather, and the grains of sand on the planet. Oh, another way, by the way, Gina, is a physicist in England who has done a mathematical computation. And you know what a 12-point Courier typewriter is? About so high. Actually, it would be a 1 with 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0. Actually, I'm being facetious. He contends that that 1 with all those zeros would be 6.5 million miles long. And that's the number of potential synapses in our brain. You know, we talked about using 10%, not even close. It may be 1/10% perhaps of its actual capacity. And so they're finding more about the brain every week. I know we found out probably more in the last 6 months than we've known in the last 6,000 years. And you know, that's what it's about, and yet we make our judgments about the protoplasm we talked about briefly that's just there to perambulate, propagate, and perpetuate the brain. What that means, of course, is to carry it around, to let it turn around and look behind the curtain, we said, and go through the door and across the horizon. And anything that does it better than the body was created by the brain and the mind. And that was the wheel, the car, the boat, the rocket, eventually. Propagating, there's a piece of the brain that just wants to propagate, is not conscious of socioeconomic conditions or sexual mores. In other words, left untended, this is going to create inappropriate behavior. And we see the result of it in our society. Unwed mothers, and not realizing that they're submitting themselves to an unconscious part of the brain that just, without any reservation, just wants to create another brain. That was just called propagation. And we have a lot of influence over that when we become conscious. Perpetuation, maintaining the environment so we can exist, all right? And we're very good at all of these. The thing of it is, you have to wonder, with all these capacities, how come after 6,000 years we're not better at this than we are? See, that's what this whole series is about, is to say, what is it we haven't misunderstood? What's been the misdirection? How come? And really, Gina, it all boils down to a little piece of the brain right in here, about the size of your pinky. In other words, the thalamus. Thalamus, the thalamus. When they examine the fibrous content, the electrochemical flowings, and the magnetisms involved, it's identical to the brain of a cat. It's called a filineal brain.
Really?
Now, I know that doesn't sound especially comfortable, but that's its function, all right? Now, let's examine. Let's take a cat, out here on the street, and say, where does it exist on that formula? Say, it's a below-the-line entity. It's a survival mechanism. It doesn't make adjustments. It can't be anything but a cat. Follow what I'm saying? And all it can do is what a cat does. You can't even train a cat. In other words, it's a below-the-line entity. Now, not if it's your cat. Because if we have a viewer who has a cat, their cat is uniquely different somehow, and they anthropomorphize it and put it well above the line, contributing and loving and what have you. But I think the truth of the matter is it's a cat. Okay? I knew a lady some time ago who really wanted a dog. She wanted the cat to do what the dog can do, and it's not going to do it. It's a below-the-line entity. And then we examine below that, about the size of a kidney bean, perhaps. You've heard the expression pea brain? That's unkind. It's about the size of a kidney bean. But it's the hypothalamus. Hypothalamus is all part of this process. And when they examine that, fibrous content, size, and function, it's reptilian or snake-like in nature. Reptilian. And, it doesn't sound very comfortable perhaps, but it's kind of like if you have a little cocoon at the base of our brain, the size of a kidney bean, that has within it a rattlesnake. Okay? And
that's a joyful thought.
Yeah, and we tend to function that way. Now, let's examine what I mean by that. Does a rattlesnake perambulate?
Yes.
You betcha. Does it propagate?
Yes.
Absolutely. And does it perpetuate in an environment? Yes. No, it fulfills that function. It's kind of like, though, you take that rattlesnake and say it's out in the hot desert and you're out walking one day and happen upon it. Startle it. Now, if you give it warning, it'll warn you off with its rattle. But if you just happen upon it, startle it, what will it probably do?
Strike.
Yeah, it'll flash out, sink its fangs into your flesh, and you may die. It doesn't make a judgment. No, it doesn't.
It's reacting.
Yeah, it just reacts to it. That's how it survives, and it can't be faulted for that. That's the way it works. In other words, we call it the fight mode. Now, you've heard this, I'm sure. Same snake, though. Same snake on another day, happen upon it, okay? And what might it do? Just slither off into the underbrush. In other words, it may flee. Now, they've been known to flee and then come back and fight, or to strike and then flee. But they'll do something along that line. That's instinct. That's just how they survive. Same snake. We don't hear much about this one. Same snake on another day may freeze. Okay? Because there's something in its primal understanding that knows that a predator doesn't want a dead snake. Now, if it happens to be an eagle or a cougar that attacked the snake and it plays dead, as it freezes up, it'll bite at it and it'll paw it and kick it around, and if it won't move, it abandons it. Because the predator doesn't want a dead snake. It wants the kill. Now, if it happened to be a vulture, snake made a mistake. You know what I mean? Because the vulture wants the carrion, and so now the snake's going to have to flip into flee or fight. See? And it's a combination of all of those, and it's done irrationally without any cognitive thought at all. What I'm leading to here, that anything less than excellent is probably caused by this reality, because I contend that we do the same thing. We function essentially the same way. That if we're not conscious, if we're not using the better part of our mind, and if things occur, we tend naturally to react. Okay? And so we do our fighting and fleeing and freezing, however, in a different way, as we do it verbally. Now, you know probably how damaging we can be with words. I mean, we can destroy a life. This Dr. John I mentioned some time ago, the 5 magic words that got him several years prior to that was the fact that someone said, who he adored, in fact his wife and babies, "We don't love you anymore." And that destroyed him. I remember some years ago, my grandson David came home and delightfully, in one day he'd learned that famous little rhyme that says, "Sticks and stones will break my bones, but names will never hurt me." You've heard that?
Yes.
And I said, "David, that's really not right." And he said, "But grandson," I said, no, I know that's what they taught you. I said, "But here's something I'd like you to learn and take back to school to see what they say." And he said, "Okay." So he relearned, "Sticks and stones may break my bones." See, that's closer to the truth, isn't it? Because they don't always. "Sticks and stones may break my bones, but names will devastate me." And right then we began to talk about how we've got to be careful of what we say to one another, what we say to ourselves, and what we allow other people to say to us. Because words can be very, very damaging. We know how to fight with words. How do we flee with them, Gina? Avoiding the issue. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? In other words, the issue comes up and a person can jabber themselves all the way around and never get to the point. That's how they flee verbally. Or they can freeze verbally. How do you freeze verbally?
Just not saying anything.
Yeah, moodiness.
Right.
It's painful to be moody, and certainly painful to be around it. But when a person is that way, they have to understand that something is going on. They're in a fear mode.
They're giving you the silent treatment.
Yeah. And what's tragic, they're afraid of something.
Yeah.
And probably loss of control, of being put down or ignored or something. But it's fear. Now, we do that verbally, and we do it kinetically. In other words, kinetically essentially is applying here small, almost meaningless gestures. The turning of a palm, turning of a head, rolling of an eye, a sneer or snicker, a snarl perhaps, or a shrugging of a shoulder could really do some damage to someone. You know, if they're the least bit sensitive, and all of us are sensitive to a degree. Now this even goes more primal than that. For example, if you encounter someone who's uncomfortable with you and in a fear mode, their eyes will pinpoint. And we know now, however, that if I, say for example, if I approach you and I want to be sure that I have the best possible chance of communicating with you favorably, that when I approach you, all I got to do is say to myself real loud in my mind, "I love you," and my eye will dilate. You will pick that up subconsciously and be a little comforted by it.
Really?
Kind of fascinating. Yeah, we
Just
do.
by saying the words in your mind,
Exactly.
you can have such an effect.
Try it, as a matter of fact. Go to the bathroom mirror and kind of settle in, looking at the mirror. Just settle in and watch and let the eye settle, and then say real loud in your mind, or out loud if you wanted to, "I love you," and you'll see the eye just dilate. Yeah, and this is a subliminal communication that we have one to the other. Body temperatures change, hair follicles will reposition the hair in the body, all kinds of interesting things will happen. But we do this verbally and kinetically and physically. Didn't take us long to realize that we could bite, you know, and punch and kick and butt and what have you. So we did that. And then, after a long, long time, we got really sophisticated. Someone had a breakthrough and realized they could pick up a rock and hit with it. That was a major step forward in survival.
Right.
You know what I mean? Defending property and hunting and what have you. Sure, physically. And then someone realized they could pick up a stick and hit with it. That gave you a little bit more range. And I don't know how long a time might have passed before someone realized you could throw the rock. You could throw it, you know what I mean? Or throw the stick, a spear, then an arrow. Then there was a big technology where you realized you could have a sling. So I was never terribly impressed with David's victory over Goliath. You know what I mean?
Really?
Oh yeah, I mean the sling, you put a rock in there. I mean, you got this big giant in front of you. Pretty easy target. When I was about 10 years old, I saw a Robin Hood movie with Errol Flynn, and they had a sling in there, and I went home. I lived on a farm all by myself, and I designed a sling with a long cord. I figured the longer the cord, the farther the throw, and the harder. And I was right, because you get that little pocket in there, and you get a good round rock, and you get to spinning it, and I got in no time at all where I could take a bird right out of the sky. It was very accurate, you know. And so a giant standing in front of you was an easy mark, and we've made entirely too much over it. Yeah, we learned. Then explosives came along to propel a pellet, and then a ball, And now we can push a button. We can push a button, send a rocket across the horizon so we don't even have to be privy to the pain and the chaos. Actually go and have a cup of coffee. Okay? But it's all done in fear. All of this is done in fear. All of this, too, contributes to what I refer to as inappropriate behavior. Now, there's different degrees of that. It could be unacceptable behavior, could be destructive behavior, but we'll say inappropriate behavior comes from being in a fear mode and functioning unconsciously. Okay? Inappropriate behavior. And unfortunately, a lot of it is based on irrational feelings. Feelings that have nothing to do with what's really happening at the moment. I'm sure you might have even encountered someone that you didn't like right away because they reminded you of someone.
And you don't even know why.
Oh, exactly.
You just have this, the hackles on the back of your neck raise, and you feel uncomfortable. And
you can bet it comes from an old tape. It
Really?
reminds you of someone. I became so conscious of this. There's a story I tell in live essay when I do them. Some years ago I was doing a series of essays at a real estate company in Texas. And I was in the second week, mid-break, and this delightful woman came up to me and said, "Mr. Moses, I come up to apologize and to say how sorry I was." And I said, "Well, of course that's accepted, but I didn't even know we had a problem." She said, "Oh yeah, we had a problem." She said, "I hated you last week. Couldn't stand the sight of you. I thought everything you said was inappropriate, that you were evil, and I told my peers about it, and they wouldn't listen to me. They seemed to be enjoying you, and I just couldn't tolerate it. Going home in the car, I was nauseous from agitation and upset. Got home, couldn't even sleep. And I finally got up, went downstairs, heated some milk, sat at the kitchen table, hoping that it would relax me, and I understand it's supposed to. And she says, all of a sudden, I realized what was wrong. I lost my husband 2 years ago to another man. Now, to her, that was especially traumatic, evidently. And who had I reminded her of?
Really?
The other guy. And of course she didn't like me. I could forgive and understand that. It didn't mean she was any less dangerous to me last week, though, because she was in a fight, flee, freeze mode out of the fear. Okay? So those were irrational feelings, and we could go on and on with illustrations about how that occurs. See, no one would kill over a parking lot, but people have. It wasn't over the parking lot. It was an accumulation of setbacks and disappointments, and all of a sudden we get to a point where we say no more, and the rattlesnake strikes. Totally irrationally. Hadn't planned on it, and we're repentant a moment after it's over. And yet if we're not careful, it can ruin a whole lifetime. Beginning to understand some of these things too, I'm hoping that in the future we begin to develop more and more understanding and compassion, and not be so quick and have so great a need for punishment as a probability of isolating someone until they can become prepared. It's about preparation as much as anything. But irrational feelings contribute to a lot of pain in our life, there's no question. Now, what's really interesting about this, there's only two primary fears, loud noises and falling. And yet we can adapt even to those. For example, it takes a whole lot of chutzpah. Are you familiar with the word chutzpah? Yeah, okay, it takes a whole lot of chutzpah to jump out of an airplane at 14,000 feet. I mean, you really got to collect your wits. You got to put all the statistics together, see the parachute packed, you know what I mean, the whole thing. But boy, the rats and roaches are running around inside regardless, because that is not a rational act. But you go and you land, and it's an exciting experience, and you do it again and maybe again, and after a while the mind adapts to the adjustments you've made. Now that's big and good news. You understand that there's a piece of your mind that will resist everything new you want to do, until the conscious mind takes over and just does it, practices it, develops some ability, and then the subconscious mind, which can be so dominant, will relinquish its authority. So
practice makes permanent then.
Exactly, exactly. Or at least practice leads you to an adaptation which allows you to do it. Now, if you don't do it for a while, it'll go back to its old considerations. Really kind of fascinating. Now, any consideration, any piece of the mind that was there will always be there. This is why there's a certain danger in being addictive. You know, they say once an alcoholic, always an alcoholic. It's only because there's a piece of the mind that has that in reserve. That is part of life's process, and that's part of all consideration. It doesn't have to win, not with a rational mind that's conscious. But the thing of it is, this is the way a lot of this works. This is about fear. What we're going to be talking about next is love. And this is pretty important. It's kind of a funny thing in the fact that we live in a paradoxical situation in that the English language is the most complex language on the planet. You know, it doesn't feel that way sometimes if you run into somebody who speaks Japanese or Chinese or Russian. But the fact is our language is the toughest, most complex. And yet we only have one word for the most complex issue in our lives, and that's love. Very complex. Now, people say coast to coast, North and South America, Canada. Yeah, but there's different kinds of love. You heard that. Mm-hmm. And we say, okay, what kind are they? And we've been taking notes. We've been taking notes. And what we hear a lot is, well, there's fatherly love and motherly love and brotherly and sisterly love, and there's a sexual love that exists between a man and woman, fraternal love, the love of friends and what have you. There's patriotism and nationalism, love of country, materialism, love of things. Agape slips in there once in a while. We say, what does that mean?
What does that mean?
Agape, typically they attribute to it God love. The implication being that we can't do that. I mean, that we're not subject to that. Self-love, we hear that a lot. Occasionally, lately, by the way, you hear a lot about unconditional love, which has to be examined pretty carefully. That's a stretch. Possible, but it's a stretch. In other words, those essentially are semantical faux pas. They're not good definitions of this circumstance. May not be the best word. As a matter of fact, in this context, we could put nurturance there probably, in that fact that nurturance is a survival mechanism in a way. You know, it's about propagating and caring for the young until they're able to care for themselves. But since we're cognitive, that compassion and that concern and that nurturance can extend beyond even those people that we know and have met. You know what I mean? There is love here. And oftentimes God has been identified as love, but too often love has not been identified as God. And so that's another issue altogether. Exciting subject. We're not communicating it well in our community. And so we say, okay, let's go back to the Greeks, see what they had to say. And they didn't have the word love in their vocabulary. Didn't have anything for it. Fascinating. But they did have 3 root words. You remember what they were? Eros, E-R-O-S, Philos, P-H-I-L-O-S.
And agape.
And agape. Right. Or agape, depending upon the school that you're from. And what we're going to be doing is to take these and examine them carefully and say, okay, these are matters of love. What do those really mean? Because those in the know say, well, that eros, that's obviously what? That's that sexual love, eros, eroticism, this type of thing. We're going to say next week, no, that's not necessarily true. There's more to it than that. Philos is a root word for philanthropy. Okay, philanthropy is not charity. So in other words, a philanthropist might give you $1 million, but what do they want? They want their name on the wing or on the street or the highway. You know what I mean? There's usually some kind of trade-out. Nothing wrong with that, by the way. Thank heaven for them. But philos is different than charity, or philanthropy is different than charity. Agape is within our range. In other words, we can, through understanding, develop our agape. And we're going to be spending a lot of time on that this next week. Any questions or comments on any of this? I know you're just bubbling with stuff.
Well, actually, I thought it was interesting when we talked about living below the line in a fear, survival, reaction mode, where we're just adapting to our environment from moment to moment, as opposed to being consciously in the moment. And I know we touched on that last week, but if we could just take a minute, I thought it would be fascinating to discuss or give some scenarios of reacting versus responding, of coming from a fear versus a love, and how we can get to the point where we're constantly and consciously choosing from moment to moment our action as a response rather than a reaction.
Because whether it be this next week or the following, we're going to get real specific about how to use the formula. But suffice it to say, I want everyone to enjoy the formula this evening, tomorrow. Let's take traffic. See, traffic is a high-stress area because we're never where we want to be. We don't want to be here, we want to be there. You know what I mean? Or there's a sense of possessiveness. Okay, now this is my space in the traffic. Some guy cuts in, he cut in on me. You know what I mean? Not that I've never done that, of course, but right now that's my space. And so all of these things, the expectations, the sense of possession, being in control, all contribute to the stress on the highway. okay? And what I'm saying is, in using the formula, just recognize that you have a choice about that. That rather than wanting to be there, which you can't be, just acknowledge the fact as to where you happen to be, where you are.
And choose to be there.
And choose to be there, because that's the only choice you've got. Okay, surrender to that fact, and you begin to go into the love mode right away.
And so that would be an example of adjusting to where you have to be now,
exactly,
instead of adapting by honking your horn. And
I was talking to a delightful man named George this past week, and he had been to see the essay, and had not taken a lot of time to integrate it and memorize it and what have you, but he talked about being in traffic, and he could feel the pressure mounting. He was really getting upset. And he remembered the formula, and he said, okay, all right, let me be here right where I am. And he began to realize he immediately felt better. And so rather than agitating and aggravating, why, he just reached into his little cubby hole and picked out a cassette tape and threw it in, and it was a motivational speaker. And he said, I had heard that tape at least 12, 15 times before, and that day, at that point in time, I heard things I had never heard. And that was because he was there. Okay? And whenever you're in the love mode, when you're ever above that line in contribution, responding instead of reacting and what have you, it's a much happier place. Now, there's a lot of things we'll be talking about, and it doesn't hurt to say it now and review it then. But when you're above that line, you're conscious, you're in command, and you're objective. What a powerful place to be. I can hardly wait till next week, and I hope our viewers feel the same way. This is Life Talk. And you can call us and get this formula and what have you by calling 1-800-661-3490. And let's see, my name is Bern
Moses.
Thank you, Gina.
Thank you, Bern.
You've been a big help tonight. And